For true fans of The Lord of the Rings, one of the most egregious rewrites that Peter Jackson made to the entire trilogy has to be Saruman's fate. Although not known to everybody since it wasn't included in the theatrical cut, Jackson ended up killing off this iconic villain at the beginning of the Return of the King film. If you're just a fan of the films, you might not know that Saruman was meant to survive until the very last moments of the entire trilogy. As one of the main antagonists that we see time and again throughout the story, both on film and on the page, Saruman's story isn't supposed to end at Isengard. However, it isn't just the fact that Saruman is killed off that is opposite to the book, as his final moments and the visit to Isengard by Gandalf and company are cut down tremendously from the exchanges we see on the pages of Tolkien's original writings. Things like Merry and Pippin finally reuniting with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, Saruman nearly overpowering the mind of Theoden, and the means by which Pippin retrieves the Palantir are all completely rewritten and changed to fit the film format. So today, I'm taking it upon myself to reveal every single detail, change, and fun fact that was removed or rewritten between these two mediums. And by the end of this video, you'll be able to decide for yourself whether or not you prefer Peter Jackson's version or Tolkien's. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 34 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Lord of the Rings edition. This is the show where I go scene by scene and compare Peter Jackson's adaptation of Tolkien's epic story to the original books to find all the differences along the way. Today, we are heading into our second episode in The Return of the King, as we just finished The Two Towers a couple weeks ago. So if you're just now tuning in, be sure to check out the first two seasons of Movies vs. Manuscripts to catch up on all the differences in the first two movies. Right now though, we're about to witness part of our fellowship reuniting at Isengard, and then our lengthy talk with Saruman, which takes up its own chapter in the book. But comparatively to Tolkien's writings about this exchange, the extended edition scene that we get in the movie is pretty short, so we've got a lot of differences to cover. Of course, I only cover the extended edition, so if you've never seen that, then you're in for a real treat today, because all of this will be completely new information to you. However, before we go any further, I wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous video. Each week, I highlight one of the top comments from one of my episodes, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happens in the film's version of these events. So picking up from where we left off last week, we see Gandalf and company riding through some trees and making their way to Isengard, which is completely surrounded by Ents and still partly flooded at this time. As the company rides up, they see Merry and Pippin on the walls enjoying a feast and a smoke break, and Gimli is delighted and upset all at the same time. We then cut to them riding up to Orthanc and encountering Treebeard, who greets Gandalf and tells him that there's a wizard to manage in the tower. Gandalf then tells the others that they need Saruman alive, and he calls out the traitor. Saruman then appears at the top of Orthanc and attempts to win over Theoden, who declines his fake offer of peace and tells the wizard that they will have peace when he hangs for the sport of his own crows. Saruman then gets angry and insults Gandalf, who calmly replies and tells Saruman that he can still turn to good and help them. Saruman then shows them the Palantir and tells them that they're all gonna die pretty much, and there's some more talking, and then eventually Saruman shoots a fireball at Gandalf, but to his astonishment, Gandalf is unharmed. Gandalf then reveals how he is now promoted to Gandalf the White, and he casts Saruman out of the order and breaks his staff. Theoden then sees Wormtongue at the top of Orthanc with Saruman, and he pleads with him to come down and rejoin them as a man of Rohan. But Saruman keeps Wormtongue from doing so and hits him. Grima obviously gets upset by this, and as Saruman is talking, he stabs him in the back. Since Gandalf had ordered for Saruman to be kept alive, Legolas shoots an arrow and kills Grima, but the damage is already done and Saruman falls to the ground with a dagger in his back. After falling, Pippin sees something shiny in the water and jumps down off his horse to see what it is. After Pippin picked up the Palantir which Saruman had showed them earlier, Gandalf realizes what he has and takes it from him. And then the movie cuts to the company riding back to Edoras, but that's a story for next week. As for this week, our changes end after they leave Isengard. So let's get right into things and address our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. As for characters, things are pretty similar. Of course, if you recall from last week, we have Quickbeam, another Ent, and he is seen guarding Orthanc at this time. Of course, one could argue that he is there in the movie, but just not named. Other than this Ent, the characters are pretty much all the same. For timeline, we have, you guessed it, time being condensed. I can't really blame Jackson for this, as you kind of have to condense time for a film version of the story, but in the book, we get a description of their journey from Helm's Deep to Isengard. Of course, we'll talk about what you missed during the plot changes. And lastly, when it comes to location, we only miss out on the company's time heading into the Wizard's Vale, and they're camping next to the Eisen before confronting Saruman. This is a key location because something interesting happens in this spot, which we'll get to at the beginning of the plot changes. But before we do, I want to remind you that I can't go into every line spoken or every word choice and change made with the dialogue. Although I try to mention as many notable changes as possible, we would literally be here for hours if I went word by word through Tolkien's pages. Especially because this week, Saruman's involvement takes up its own chapter, which is 90% monologue. I think we all can accept that it's a given that a filmmaker has to rewrite some dialogue to make it fit in the proper time frame. Like I said though, if something comes up and I see it as a notable dialogue shift or word change, I'll do my best to mention it. For everything else, I highly encourage you check out the audiobooks. You can claim your free copy of The Return of the King or any other audiobook of your choice on Audible by signing up for a free trial using my link in the description. It helps support the channel, and you get to relive the story in a whole new way. But that being said, let's jump into the plot changes. To start things off this week, we pick up from where we left off last time with our company of heroes heading to Isengard from their victory at Helm's Deep. In the chapter, The Road to Isengard, we learn about their journey from point A to point B, and in my episode on Helm's Deep, I already addressed the first half of this journey. However, we now can resume their journey, as in the movie we see them slowly moving through the woods and then coming to Isengard. There's mainly one detail left out of the movie, which Tolkien makes a point to talk about, and that is their night of camping on the outskirts of the Wizard's Vale. You see, Isengard was in a valley at the feet of the Misty Mountains, and that place was called Nan Curunír, aka Saruman's Vale. As the company approached the outskirts of this valley, they saw steam rising from it, and took note of this odd phenomenon, with Éomer guessing that Saruman was brewing up some new devilry for them. Little do they know that this is actually the result of the Ents flooding the valley, but they'll find out about that in a bit. But before they get there, one other strange event happens, which the movie doesn't show, and that is the strange wall of mist and darkness in the night that moves past their encampment. We read that during the night, the watchmen shouted out that something odd was happening, and Gandalf and company woke up to see the stars were shining, but either side of the river was a darkness that crept along the ground. Blacker than night, this wall of darkness seemed to move past them, and Gandalf shouted for all of the men to stay where they were and not draw their weapons. They heard whispers, voices, and groanings most of the night, but eventually the darkness passed. We're never clearly told what this is in the book, but we can figure out through context clues later on that this would have been the Huorns coming back from their yummy orc meal at Helm's Deep. After all, in the book, Tolkien does something odd here and splices in a random paragraph which takes us back to the men of Helm's Deep, and we learn that they woke up the next morning to see that the forest that was once there the night before was completely gone now. We can assume that this darkness which passed Gandalf at the Eisen was actually Fangorn Forest heading back home. The next thing we read in the book is a long description of the valley where Isengard is located and how it used to be in the past. We learn some of the history of its name, Saruman's life there, and how it is now a desolate land ruined by Saruman's industry. The wall of Isengard surrounded Orthanc and was massive, with homes and stores built into it for Saruman's orcs and servants. But all of this really isn't our next change, as we all know that Tolkien took advantage of his ability to be as descriptive as possible, and the movie can't perfectly replicate this long history lesson. No, our next change actually has to do with Merry and Pippin, as the company in the movie finally comes to the gates of Isengard and sees the two hobbits smoking there. Obviously, as is the case for most of our scenes, the dialogue between the hobbits and the company that has just arrived is very much extended in the book. But Gimli does greet the hobbits in a half-angry, half-happy manner, and after a bit of back and forth, the other riders laughed. And Theoden remarked that they obviously have just witnessed the reuniting of friends. He then asks Gandalf if these are the two of their company which were lost earlier on, and then he remarks that in Rohan they are called Hobbitlan. Pippin then corrects the king and tells him that they're called hobbits, and then he tells them that he is the first person they've met who is familiar with the race of hobbits, even if by a different name. Then we have a funny moment as Theoden mentions what they know of the hobbits, which is little, but he adds on that he hadn't heard that they spouted smoke from their mouths, referencing Merry and Pippin smoking. Merry then answered that smoking is an art form which is recent in their culture, and that it began in the year 1070 when Tobold Hornblower of Longbottom grew the first true pipeweed. But as Merry was going on, Gandalf cut him off and remarked to Theoden that he does not know his danger, as hobbits will sit on the edge of ruin and discuss their pleasures and culture for ages if you encourage them. It is then after this that Gandalf finally gets to the point and learns from the hobbits that the Ents are guarding Orthanc and Saruman is inside. And Merry adds on that Treebeard is waiting for Gandalf at the northern wall. And this is where we have our next change, as in the movie we simply see the company riding straight to Orthanc after meeting the hobbits. But in the book, after this message from Merry, Gandalf rode with Theoden, Éomer, and their men to meet Treebeard. At this time, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli stayed back with the two hobbits and enjoyed a nice meal and smoking together for several hours as they caught up on all Merry and Pippin's adventures. For the sake of time, because I have already covered much of it, I won't dive into everything they discuss here. All you need to know is that they learn what the two hobbits have been up to over the last week or so that they've been lost. Then, after a long silence and some good smoking, they finish up their conversation by talking about Grima Wormtongue. We learn that Wormtongue rode to Isengard earlier that same morning, and after seeing the wreck, pretended to be a messenger of King Theoden. But because Gandalf had already visited and warned Treebeard of this traitor, Treebeard forced Grima to walk through the murky waters and join his master in Orthanc. Finally, before getting to Saruman's involvement, we have one more detail I wanted to mark as a separate change, which is the mystery of the Longbottom Leaf. Aragorn remarks to the hobbits that he thinks it's odd that Saruman would have Longbottom Leaf at Isengard, and that he must have had secret dealings with someone in the Shire. Aragorn says that this could be an ill omen, but since the crop that these barrels came from were marked 2 years prior, he says it might be resolved by now. However, he tells the hobbits that he will inform Gandalf, even though Gandalf has much bigger issues to manage. As book fans know, this is another foreshadowing of the Scouring of the Shire. We already got a taste for it in the Fellowship of the Ring when Sam looked into the Mirror of Galadriel, but here we are again with ideas of ill tidings from the Hobbit's homeland. But hey, that's for a much later episode of Movies vs. Manuscripts, so we won't dwell on it now. What we need to get to now is the focal point of this whole episode, the company's confrontation with Saruman. When analyzing the conversation that Gandalf and company have with Saruman at Orthanc, there are many changes, some small and some large. So let's pick through these one by one, starting with an easy one, which is Treebeard greeting them as they ride up to the tower. Obviously, in the book, Gandalf has already met with the Ent and formed some plans as we learn in this chapter, which is called the Voice of Saruman. After resting, we read that our feasting fellowship got up and walked toward Orthanc, as they were curious what Gandalf was up to. They then saw the king's company and the wizard riding towards the tower, and Legolas said that they should go meet them. After everybody joined back up together, Gandalf informed them that he had time to speak with Treebeard and form some new plans. But before leaving Isengard, he must deal with Saruman. This is where we come to our next change, which is that in the movie, we only have our main characters, but in the book, there are about 25 people total. Gandalf tells them that he is going up to Orthanc to call on Saruman, and our main characters go with him. However, there are the king's riders in the background of this entire encounter. Next, we have a couple changes regarding the visual we get in the movie. First, we're told that there are stairs leading up to the tower, and it must have been quite a distance because Gandalf and Theoden get off their horses and go up to the front door. Gandalf takes Aragorn, and Theoden takes Éomer. Then Gimli remarks that he and Legolas want to go up too, as they're the sole representatives of their people groups, so he and the elf go up as well. This essentially leaves our two hobbits on the bottom of the stairs as the rest of the company are up at the front door calling on Saruman. The second visual change is that Saruman is not on top of the tower like what we see in the movie, but rather he pokes his head out of a window above them. One could imagine that this is the same balcony we've seen him on earlier in the movies. We're told in the book that it was directly above the door, and although Orthanc had only one massive door as an entrance, there were many windows carved into the tower. I also gotta mention that this book version is way more realistic because although Saruman has magical voice capabilities which would allow him to project his voice from a mile high down to the people, I've always wondered how in the world Wormtongue heard Theoden speaking to him when Theoden is practically whispering. Anyway, after Gandalf shouted for Saruman to come out of the door, they heard Wormtongue speaking from the balcony above, although hidden, and he asked who it is and what do they wish. Gandalf, recognizing the slimy voice of this traitor, demanded that he fetch his master, and this is finally when Saruman approached the balcony. Now we've come to the last stand of Saruman and his House of Stone as he cunningly tries to put his words to use in molding the minds of the company to his will. There's a reason the corresponding chapter to the scene is called The Voice of Saruman, and it's because most of this chapter is just the wizard talking. But more importantly, it is titled this because the voice of Saruman is not a normal voice. Before approaching, Gandalf tells the company to beware of Saruman's voice as it has power to control and deceive. In the movie, we have three main parts to the conversation before Saruman's demise. First, let's address his conversation with the king. In the movie, I don't think you can call it much of a conversation, but in the book, it is quite long. I can't go into all the details, but what I wanted to mention is that it seems for a bit like the wizard is influencing Theoden once again. As we read this passage in the book, we learn that the riders waiting behind their king were slowly convinced and deceived by Saruman's voice as he asked for peace. And when Theoden started saying, "We shall have peace," they rejoiced as they thought their king was going to make peace with Saruman. However, the only man who wasn't fooled was Eomer, who told his king to remember Theodred, who died at the fords, and the grave of Hama at Helm's Deep. It is then after this remark from Eomer that the king finally says, "We shall have peace." And just like in the movie, he essentially tells Saruman to go die. One small but impactful word change is that in the book he says, "What will you say for your torches in the Westfold and the children that lie dead there?" And they hewed Hama's body before the gates of the Hornburg after he was dead. The change being that in the movie, he mentions bodies hewn at the Hornburg, but not Hama's. As we know, Hama was killed off earlier in the Two Towers at the wrong place, whereas in the book, Theoden was greatly attached to his door warden, and he was even the first to cast earth upon Hama's grave. It is actually in the book after Hama's burial that Theoden says, "Great injury indeed has Saruman done to me and all this land, and I will remember it when we meet." So I know that this is a small line change the movie makes, but it hits pretty hard in the book when Theoden is shouting at Saruman about Hama's death at the gate of the Hornburg. Anyway, now we come to the second part of Saruman's dialogue in the movie, which is when he holds up the Palantir and declares that something festers in the heart of Middle-earth. Simply put, this never happens in the book. As we'll see in a bit, the Palantir doesn't come up until after all these conversations, and it's really an afterthought at this point in the book. But obviously, as a filmmaker, Peter Jackson is trying to draw attention to this object, which has been shown in the previous movies. Finally, although a little bit out of order, the third moment I consider in this conversation from the movie is when Saruman addresses Gandalf. This is similar to the book, with Saruman trying to accuse Gandalf of wanting all the staffs of the wizards for himself and power and all that. Obviously, as you know, the book version is a lot more drawn out, but for the most part, it's the same. What isn't the same is that Saruman doesn't shoot a ball of fire at Gandalf. Although it's cool in the movie, this is highly unlikely and not Tolkien's style of magic. What really happens is that after Saruman refuses to come down and treat with Gandalf, he tries retreating back into his tower. Gandalf then speaks to him in a commanding tone and tells him to come back out because he isn't done with him yet. Saruman is then pulled almost by an invisible force back out to the balcony. Gandalf then reveals himself to Saruman as Gandalf the White, and says that since Saruman has refused all reason and become a fool, his staff is broken and he is cast from the Order and the Council. Then, after the staff shatters, he tells Saruman he can go, and Saruman retreats back into the tower. Quickly, a small change, but a change nonetheless, is the fact that Theoden doesn't tell Grima to come down to him. In the book, Theoden isn't as forgiving, and is not keen on having Wormtongue rejoin his people. But now back to Saruman and his retreat into Orthanc in the book, this is where we come to our largest change in the movie version. Saruman is not killed off, and neither is Wormtongue. That's right, in the book, Saruman retreats into Orthanc after having his staff broken, and we won't see him or Wormtongue again for a long time. But now we have a change immediately after that one, which is all about the Palantir. You see, after Saruman retreated into the tower, a large shiny object was hurled out of the window and narrowly missed Gandalf. Gandalf rightly guesses that it wasn't thrown by Saruman, but by Wormtongue as a parting shot. Aragorn then remarks that he doesn't know if the ball was meant to hit Saruman or Gandalf, because who knows which wizard Grima hates more. This ball which was thrown was obviously the Palantir, and after it bounced down the stairs into the water, Pippin grabbed it. So at least that part is similar to the movie. Obviously what isn't similar is the way in which they obtain the Palantir, because in the movie, they get it from Saruman's dead body after he fell. Now, just a little side note here. In all honesty guys, I've never seen the theatrical versions of these movies. And as I was writing this, I was curious how exactly they come to get the Palantir in the theatrical version, since Saruman never falls. Well, I just watched it, and I gotta say, I'm a little let down. As you know if you've seen both versions, Peter Jackson tries to stick with Tolkien's story in the theatrical cut, as he keeps Saruman alive, but in his extended cut he kills him off. It's a give and take, but in the version where Saruman gets killed, at least there's a somewhat logical way that Pippin obtains the Palantir. In the theatrical cut, I'm very curious as to how this valuable item just got to be laying in the water randomly. But anyway, that's just a little mini rant from me. Moving on. After all of these events, the company heads away from Orthanc and Gandalf meets back up with Treebeard, who wasn't present during this conversation. In fact, the book makes a point to say that all the Ents hid during this exchange, probably because Gandalf didn't think Saruman would show himself if the Ents were out. But anyway, Gandalf meets Treebeard and informs him of what happened, and instructs him to watch over Orthanc to ensure that Saruman doesn't escape. He even tells Treebeard to keep filling Isengard with water until it stops draining, because there might be secret tunnels by which Saruman could escape without the Ents knowing. Also, the last note I'll add on here is a small exchange between Treebeard and Legolas, as Legolas tells him he plans on visiting Fangorn with a friend. Treebeard then says that he and any other elves are welcome to come to the forest, but Legolas informs him that he wasn't speaking of an elf, but his friend Gimli. At this, Gimli bowed to the Ent and his axe fell from his belt. Treebeard obviously was not keen on this idea of an axe bearer coming into his forest, but Legolas, being the true friend he is, stuck up for Gimli and told Treebeard that the dwarf cut down 42 orcs in their previous battle. And after this, Treebeard is put at ease in regards to the dwarf. Then the chapter ends with Treebeard telling Gandalf that he and the Ents will watch over Orthanc and Saruman for 7 times the amount of years that Saruman tormented them. And on that note, that wraps up all of our changes for this week. So now that you've got the big picture of this scene and how many revisions and changes Peter Jackson and his team made to Tolkien's original work, what do you think? Do you think these changes were the right decision? Also, if you've seen both the theatrical and the extended cut, let me know in the comments which fate you prefer for Saruman. The one where he doesn't show him and he's just left as a prisoner of Orthanc, or the extended version in which he's killed off? Of course, today I couldn't go into the Scouring of the Shire and Saruman's death there, but as many of you know, we'll get there eventually at the end of the series. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.